Hello, welcome to Executive Dashboards video series from DoSQLBI.com. This series is about executive dashboards covering three different technologies on the Microsoft platform. In part 1, we are looking at Power View. In part 2, we would look at Performance Point Services. And in part 3, we would look at SSRS dashboards and business alerts. In part 1, we had gone over the Power View dashboards, covering in the first session business scenario and then the pre-built solution walkthrough. And in the third one, we had seen the deployment options that are possible with Power View dashboards. In this fourth part of this first series, we'll be going over the implementation details. Basically, the solution that we provided the walkthrough, we will get into development details that what all is required and how do you do the development of that dashboard. We will first see what are the prerequisites to do that development. The next step would be to explore the transaction data, followed by building of the data model. Once the data model is created, we will enrich that data model to support more meaningful insights when we create the dashboards. And the last item would be building the dashboard itself using Power View. For Power View dashboards, as a developer, we need to know what are the prerequisites. The first one is Power Pivot, which can be made available as Power Pivot for Excel or as SSAS Tabular. So if you have Analysis Services Tabular version installed, that is sufficient to do with this particular prerequisite. However, in this video, we would use the Excel as the Power Pivot for Excel. The development of the dashboard and building of the data model, one can do that in Excel. As I said, we would use Excel in this session, and later we would have a quick look at Visual Studio Data Tools, how that can be used for the development purpose. And last, the need of Power View itself to create the Power View dashboard, which is based on Silverlight technology. So the next thing to see is the transaction data exploration. What we do in exploring the transaction data is to get, as a developer, the understanding of the data. By having the appropriate understanding of the transaction data, the data generated by various business activities, we need to be able to figure out what are various ways this data can be presented, or to say what are the interesting dimensions that this data can be analyzed. What are the facts? What are the dimensions? Is the end result of transaction data exploration. What we would do is we would look at the transaction data that was used in building the dashboard demoed in the previous sessions. Let me switch to the Excel file. What you see is the transaction data related to the timesheet. Let's see what does this data contain. It's an Excel. The first column is the project. These are all various timesheet entries. The first one is on the project training. Then its next column is the manager name, week starts on, what is the billing type, was it billable, non-billable, then the employee name, and then there were column for weekend, Saturday, Sunday, then there is this total column, what is the approval status, when it was created and who last modified it, what is the practice name, and then there were similarly as expected columns for Monday through Friday. This data is real, but it has been masked for the individual and business privacy purpose, but this is a real meaningful data. So by looking at this transaction data, we would need to figure out what could be the possible dimensions that one can create. It's very obvious one such dimension would be the project. I would want to analyze my timesheet data by projects. Which project has been doing how much billable hours, non-billable hours, and who are the employees, who are the managers, and things like that. Another dimension could be the manager, where I see the timesheet data based on various managers. Then the date, again another important one. The date that is here is the week starts on. That is the date that is captured per entry. Billing type would be another dimension. Employee could be another dimension where one can analyze the employees and see various things like how much billable hours they have logged and non-billable hours, the weekend versus the weekdays, and the time off they had taken, and things like that. Approval status could be another interesting dimension. How many approved and not approved or pending status. Then the practice name could be another dimension. What is the timesheet data by practice? So apparently there doesn't seem to be anything meaningful that one can draw by these columns Monday through Friday or Saturday, Sunday. Maybe we can later on, once we get into data model enrichment, one can create certain calculated columns where, say, for example, we want to see how many hours were put on the weekend compared to the weekdays. So this is the data, the transaction data that was utilized for creating the dashboard that we had earlier seen in one of the sessions. In our case, we are using the data in the Excel file as a source. In most of the cases, you would just want to do something like this when you are doing a POC, and in the real project then refer to the actual data sources. It could be a database system where all your data is stored, and it could be any other sources that are available where the data is actually getting saved in the first place. By having it in Excel, it becomes easier to do the initial work of data model building. You'll see it once we go to the next points. Let me switch back to the presentation. So we looked at the transaction data that we are going to use for building the dashboard, and we also briefly touched upon what are the interesting dimensions that we would be wanting to create. The third step in the process of dashboard development is to build the data model, and in our case we will do that activity in the Excel itself using the transaction data which is also stored in the Excel. Just to add, this data was pulled basically from the SharePoint list initially, and then further processing we'll be doing in the Excel. So as we first thought that we would have one of the dimension as projects, I will copy whole of this list of projects and I go and create another sheet. I paste this data here. Now this is directly the copy paste of all the project entries, which certainly are duplicate because I just directly copied it from the transaction data. Excel has this small little nice thing. You click on the data and this remove duplicates. So I click on the remove duplicates. It tells me, does your data have a header, and it picked up the name as the project. I say okay. So what it did is it deleted all the duplicate entries and left only 52 unique values. So basically, which means we have a unique 52 different projects in that transaction data where from we copied it. So once I did that, what I would just want to do is do little formatting. I just go here, clear any fill out. Then once that is done, I again select my data, and now Excel has this format as table. So I'm going and I can choose any one of them. So let me choose this one. It automatically showed me the range. My table has headers, so that is checked because we have this project here, and we say okay. Now what it did is it converted this data range into a table and gave it the name. I clicked on the design and it gave it the name table 2. What I would want to give it a name is projects, and also rename this sheet 1 to project. So what I have now is a table with a unique project names as second sheet in this Excel file, and we did it by copying the project name column which was from the transaction data. In most of the development scenarios, you would have this project as one of the lookup table. All you need to do is just go and pull it from there. You can connect it directly from Excel and pull that project table which has the project entries as the lookup table. Now what we will do is similarly, we will go and create more tables from manager, week starts on, billing type, employee name, approval status, and then practice name. Okay, so what we did is we created this managers table. See the table name here is managers. From the managers data here, in the same way we created earlier the projects table. Then we created the date table from the week starts on table, and then billing type table from the billing type, employees from the employee, approval status from the approval statuses, and practice name from this practice name. During our data exploration, these were the entities that we thought are of interest for our data model and dashboard creation. And in this exercise, we created all these dimensions. In most of the cases, we will have these dimensions: practice name, approval status, employee, and so on, as the lookup tables in the database management system. So the first part of our data model designing was to come up with a list of dimensions. Now what we do is we go and add all these tables to our data model. And when we do that from within Excel, it's Power Pivot tab, which allows me to add a table to the data model. So we would start with adding ERMS, which was our transaction data. So it just opened the Power Pivot for Excel as a second window. And as you see, this is the timesheet data of about 15 months. So there are some 7,499 records in this table. Now what you see here is it created this table in the data model, which is linked to the data source, which is the Excel sheet itself. It could have come directly from any other sources. As you could see here, from a database, I could pull it from the SQL Server, from Access, from analysis services. It supports all the ranges of data sources that Power Pivot supports, which we had seen in one of the sessions earlier. But right now, this data in the Power Pivot table is sourced from the Excel file, which is this. So if I make any change here and then I refresh, the data in the table would get updated. In a similar fashion, that if we have the Power Pivot data coming from the database and any change happens there, we refresh the data so that data model data would get refreshed as well. So I'll go now to the projects table, add this to the data model. Next, go to the managers, add that to the data model. Next, go to the date, add date to the data model. Go to the billing type, add that to the data model. Employees, approval status, and lastly, this practice name. Until this point, we have pulled in all the tables that we built within Excel. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of them, and we should have the same 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of them in the Power Pivot data model. The next thing we need to do is to create the relationships in this data. Now again, I want to mention here that in most of the implementations, we would have these lookup tables where there would be some IDs and the name, and then the transaction data would contain the IDs instead of the actual lookup value names. In our example, and the case that we had demoed in the previous sessions was based on this transaction data. And this is one of the good example for doing the POCs in a very short time, where you just get the transaction data, dump it into the Excel, and then start all your work of modeling and dashboard creation all within that. I can switch to the diagram view and little bit reorganize my tables. So this timesheet is like our transaction table. I'm getting these dimension tables on the side. This is date. So doing it visually becomes a little faster. Then billing type, I have employee here. Then there is this approval status, and the last one is practice names. I can now zoom it back in, reduce this a bit size, get this here, and get the practice name here. So our transaction table can just make it this long. So what I can start now doing is to create these relationships. So I just pull the project. It gives me a visual way of creating this relationship. This could have been done through another interface where I select the table, I select the columns. We'll just see that, but this visual way becomes a faster way to do it. And while we are just setting up this relationship, it is cross-checking whether there is any violation, whether we have some data in the transaction table which doesn't have the lookup entry in this lookup table or the dimension table. Week starts on goes to week starts on. Take this billing type, take it to billing type, and then employee goes to employee. Approval status goes to approval status, and practice manager goes to the practice manager. So what we have now is we have all the lookup tables, the dimension tables, which we first created in the first place. Let us zoom it to 100%. So we created these lookup tables using the Excel itself from the transaction data, and then we added these tables to the data model, and then we set up the relationships between the transaction table and the lookup tables. We are right now in the Power Pivot data model window. We can just go see this manage relationships. Say all these relationships which were created got listed here. I can go and say edit. Here is where I see the transaction table name and the column, and then the lookup table name, and then the lookup column with what the relationship is there. With this, let's come back to the present. Not to forget that we should save this. So once we now save, it is going to save our data model and the relationships that we created. If we want to go back to the data model window, can just say manage and come back to this. I can change this view from the diagram view to the data. So I see all these tables which we earlier added. You see these small relationships information showing up here with what table it is related. So I have my project where it is related to the project table, and the column name is project. Similarly, this manager, I can just select it all and then have it expanded. Week starts on. This indicates the relationships. Say Saturday, Sunday, it's not related to anything. That's why you don't see a two table icon like this. Everything looks good. The relationships have been established. I make sure I save it once again, and let me come back to our presentation. What we did is we were looking at the building of the data model, under which what we did is we build the dimensions first from our transaction data, and in most of the project implementations, these would be the lookup tables already available. All we need to do is to pull them into the data model. And what we did in our example is we extracted these dimensions from the transaction data. The next activity we had done was to populate those dimensions. So the way we populated our dimensions was to get the transaction data, copy it over to the next sheet, remove the duplicates, format the range of that data as table, and we did that for all our dimensions. We did that cleanup of removing the duplicates, and then finally we set up the relationships. So that covered our first three items of this developer session 1 for building of Power View reports. In the next sessions, we would see how we will enrich that data model to create more meaningful information that we would subsequently present in the dashboards. I'm Nasser Ali Mirza at DoSQLBI.com. Thanks.